The house was quiet, almost eerily so. The hum of the air conditioner and the occasional chirp of birds outside were the only sounds that broke the silence. I stood in the kitchen, wiping down the last plate, when I felt it, the weight of someone's gaze on me. It wasn't fleeting, it was deliberate, lingering, as if studying me. When I turned, there he was, standing in the doorway. Tyler. My stepson. His presence wasn't unusual. He had lived here, in this house, ever since his father and I got married 5 years ago. Tyler was 22, polite, and respectful, the kind of young man who held doors open and said thank you without prompting. But lately, something had shifted. His gaze, once neutral, now felt intense. As if he were trying to figure something out, to read something in me. Do you need something? I asked, keeping my voice steady. He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. No. Just thinking. About what? I could have asked, but I didn't. Deep down, I already knew the answer. And maybe, just maybe, a part of me wanted to hear him say it out loud. Instead, I turned back to the sink, watching the soapy water swirl down the drain. Dinner was uneventful, if you ignored the tension hanging in the air. We sat at the table, the TV in the living room murmuring something about the weather, and I tried to make conversation. How's school going? I asked, serving myself a salad. It's fine, he replied, but there was a strange edge to his voice that I hadn't noticed before. Any plans for the summer? Not yet. He was looking at me, and I could feel his gaze. It was as if he were waiting for something, searching for an opening to say what he'd been holding back. Later, as I was heading upstairs, there was a knock at my bedroom door. It was late, too late for casual conversation. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, my heart suddenly racing. Who is it? I asked, though I already knew. It's me, Tyler's voice came from the other side.
I opened the door. He stood there in the hallway, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. Tyler. What's wrong? I asked, trying to sound calm. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, a mix of uncertainty and determination. You don't know how to say this, he began, his voice trembling. I don't know what I'm doing. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a mix of unease and something else I didn't want to acknowledge. Tyler, I started carefully. This isn't... I know, he interrupted. But it doesn't change anything, does it? His words hit me like a punch. I should have stepped back, closed the door, and put an end to whatever was starting, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there looking at him, feeling the boundaries between us begin to blur. The night was quiet, but the tension in the house was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. After that conversation at the door, I retreated to my room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Tyler had left, but his words echoed in my mind. It doesn't change anything, does it? What did he mean? And why couldn't I just shut the door? I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept circling back to Tyler, his gaze, his words. He was young, almost a decade younger than me, and I was his stepmother. This was wrong. It was dangerous. So why did a part of me feel something else entirely? The next morning, I came downstairs, expecting to see him at the breakfast table, but the kitchen was empty. A note lay on the counter, gone to the library. Be back tonight. I sighed in relief, but at the same time, I felt a strange pang of disappointment. The day passed in a blur of mundane tasks, laundry, cleaning, preparing dinner. I tried not to think about the night before, but my mind kept drifting back to Tyler, to the way he'd looked at me, to what he'd said.
When he returned that evening, I was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. He walked in, dropped his backpack on a chair, and sat down at the table. How was the library? I asked, trying to sound casual. Fine, he replied, not looking at me. We ate in silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound in the room. I could feel his eyes on me occasionally, but I didn't dare meet his gaze. After dinner, he did the dishes while I retreated to the living room, turning on the TV but unable to focus on what was happening on the screen. After a while, he joined me, sitting on the other end of the couch. The distance between us felt both too close and too far. The days that followed were a strange mix of normalcy and tension. Tyler and I danced around each other, careful not to cross any lines, yet unable to ignore the unspoken thing that hung between us. It was in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It was in the way my heart raced whenever he was near. One evening, as I was reading on the couch, he sat down beside me, closer than usual. I could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of his cologne. My breath caught, but I didn't move. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice low. I looked up from my book, meeting his gaze. "Of course." He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like you're just going through the motions, waiting for something to happen?" His question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Sometimes." "Why do you ask?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know. I feel like there's something more, you know? Like I'm missing something." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I knew that would only make things more complicated. Instead, I stayed silent, letting the moment pass. But the tension between us didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more palpable. I could feel it in the way our hands brushed when we passed each other in the hallway, in the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It was a dangerous game we were playing, one with no clear rules and no easy way out. The days blurred together, each one carrying the weight of unspoken words and lingering glances. Tyler and I existed in a strange limbo, neither of us willing to address the growing tension between us, yet neither of us able to ignore it. It was in the way he lingered in the kitchen after dinner, pretending to scroll through his phone while I washed the dishes. It was in the way I found myself dressing more carefully in the mornings, wondering if he'd notice the subtle changes. One afternoon, I was in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds. The sun was warm on my back, and the scent of blooming roses filled the air. I heard the back door open and close, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel his presence before he even spoke. "Need any help?" Tyler's voice was casual, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. I glanced up, shielding my eyes from the sun. He stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, his t-shirt clinging to his frame in a way that made it hard to look away. "Sure," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "You can start on that patch over there." He nodded and knelt beside me, his movements deliberate and careful. For a while, we worked in silence, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But the air between us was charged, electric, and I could feel his eyes on me every time I reached for a weed or brushed dirt from my hands. "You're good at this," he said after a while, breaking the silence. I laughed softly, though my chest felt tight. "Years of practice. My mom loved gardening. She taught me everything I know." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I never really got into it. Always seemed like too much work." "It can be," I admitted. "But there's something satisfying about it. Seeing something grow because of the effort you put in." He didn't respond right away, and when I looked over at him, he was staring at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Nothing. Just, you're different than I thought you'd be." I raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore the way my heart was pounding. "Different how?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I don't know. When Dad first brought you home, I thought you'd be. I don't know, more like him. But you're not. You're softer. Kind." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," I finally said, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground between us. I guess I never really took the time to get to know you before. But now." He trailed off, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Now what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, I felt as if the world had stopped. Now I can't stop thinking about you, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I should have said something, anything, to break the tension, to remind him of who we were, of the boundaries we couldn't cross. But I couldn't. Instead, I just sat there, my hands trembling, my heart racing, as the truth of his words settled over me. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Tyler's confession had shattered the fragile balance between us, leaving us both adrift in a sea of uncertainty. We avoided each other during the day, retreating to separate corners of the house, but at night, when the world was quiet and the darkness felt like a shield, the tension between us became unbearable. One evening, I found myself standing in front of his bedroom door, my hand raised to knock but hesitating. What was I doing? This was wrong. It was dangerous. But the pull was too strong, the need to see him, to talk to him, overwhelming. Before I could change my mind, the door opened, and there he was, standing in front of me, his eyes wide with surprise. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Then, without thinking, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and kissed him. It was a mistake. I knew it even as it was happening. But in that moment, it felt inevitable, like the culmination of everything that had been building between us. His lips were warm against mine, his hands tentative as they reached for me, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself forget about the consequences. But reality came crashing back all too quickly. I pulled away, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I shouldn't have." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Don't apologize." I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears, and saw the same conflict in his eyes that I felt in my own heart. "This is wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "We can't." "I know," he said, cutting me off again. "But that doesn't change how I feel." His words were like a knife to my chest, cutting through the walls I'd built around my heart. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we couldn't do this, that it would destroy everything. But the look in his eyes stopped me. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek, wiping away a tear. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't pretend this isn't happening. Not anymore." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We were careful, always aware of the consequences, but the pull between us was too strong to resist. It was in the way his hand brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hallway, in the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It was in the way my heart raced whenever he was near. But the guilt was always there, lurking beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the line we were crossing. I tried to push it aside, to focus on the moments we had together, but it was always there, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. One evening, as we sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background, I turned to him, my heart heavy with the weight of everything we were risking. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "But I don't know how to stop." His words echoed my own thoughts, and for a moment, I felt a surge of frustration. Why did this have to be so complicated? Why couldn't we just be together without the guilt, without the fear? But deep down, I knew the answer. We were playing with fire, and sooner or later, we were going to get burned. The guilt was a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of my conscience. Every stolen glance, every fleeting touch, every whispered conversation felt like a betrayal, not just to Tyler's father, but to myself. I had always prided myself on being a good person, someone who made the right choices, even when they were hard. But this was something else entirely. This was a line I never thought I'd cross, and yet here I was, standing on the other side, unsure of how to find my way back. Tyler, on the other hand, seemed less burdened by the weight of our secret. Or maybe he was just better at hiding it. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, as if he'd made peace with the choices we'd made. But I could see the cracks in his facade, the moments when his guard slipped and the doubt crept in. It was in the way he'd sometimes pull away from me, his eyes distant, his expression unreadable. It was in the way he'd avoid talking about the future, as if acknowledging it would make it real. One night, as we sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above us, I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting me. "What are we doing, Tyler?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I do know that I can't just stop. Not now." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair, to your dad, to us, to everyone." He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and intense. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low. The question caught me off guard. Did I regret it? The truth was, I didn't know. I regretted the lies, the secrecy, the guilt. But the moments we'd shared, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, I couldn't bring myself to regret those. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment, we just sat there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. The tension between us grew with each passing day, a constant undercurrent that neither of us could ignore. We were careful, always aware of the risks, but the pull was too strong to resist. It was in the way his hand would linger on my arm when he passed me in the hallway, in the way his eyes would meet mine across the room, filled with a mixture of longing and guilt. But the cracks were starting to show. I could feel the strain of our secret weighing on me, the constant fear of being discovered gnawing at the edges of my mind. I started to withdraw, pulling away from Tyler even as he tried to pull me closer. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background, I turned to him, my heart heavy with the weight of everything we were risking. "We need to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Because it's wrong? Because we're scared? What's the point of living if we're just going to keep hiding from what we really want?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that there were consequences to our actions. But the look in his eyes stopped me. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to be with you and not feel like I'm destroying everything." He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek, and for a moment, I let myself lean into his touch. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "Together." But even as he said the words, I could hear the doubt in his voice. We both knew that this wasn't something we could just figure out. This was a mess of our own making, and sooner or later, it was going to come crashing down around us. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday evening, and Tyler's father was due home from his business trip the next day. The house was quiet, the air thick with tension as we both tried to pretend that everything was normal. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when Tyler walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me with that intense gaze that always made my heart race. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "About us. About what happens next." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Tyler, I don't know. I can't keep doing this," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I can't keep pretending that this isn't real. That you don't mean everything to me." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Tyler, we can't. why not? He demanded, his voice rising. Why can't we just be together? Why does it have to be so complicated? Because it is. I shot back, my voice breaking. Because this isn't just about us. It's about your dad, about this family, about everything we're risking. He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. And what about what we're losing? What about the chance to be happy? Doesn't that matter? I wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that there were consequences to our actions. But the look in his eyes stopped me. He was right. We were losing something, something precious and irreplaceable. But that didn't change the fact that what we were doing was wrong. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. The next morning, Tyler's father came home. He walked through the door, his usual cheerful self, completely unaware of the storm that had been brewing in his absence. I tried to act normal, to smile and laugh and pretend that everything was fine, but it was hard. Every time I looked at Tyler, I could see the tension in his eyes, the way he avoided my gaze, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. We made it through dinner, the conversation light and superficial, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words. Afterward, Tyler excused himself, claiming he had homework to do, and I retreated to the living room, my mind racing. I knew we couldn't keep going like this. The guilt, the fear, the constant tension, it was too much. But I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to walk away from something that felt so right, even as it tore me apart. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between what I wanted and what I knew was right. I had to end it, for both of our sakes. The next morning, I waited until Tyler's father had left for work before knocking on Tyler's door. He opened it, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. I closed the door behind me, my heart pounding as I turned to face him. "This has to stop," I said, my voice firm. "We can't keep doing this. It's not fair, to your dad, to us, to everyone." He stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. "So that's it?" he demanded. "You're just going to walk away?" "I have to," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't keep living like this, Tyler. I can't keep pretending that this isn't destroying me." He stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "And what about me? What about what I want?" I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I didn't wipe it away. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "But this is the only way." For a moment, he just stood there, his chest rising and falling with the force of his emotions. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Tyler avoided me, his anger and hurt palpable every time we crossed paths. I tried to give him space, to respect his need to process everything, but it was hard. Every time I saw him, my heart ached with the weight of everything we'd lost. His father, oblivious to the tension between us, tried to keep things normal. He talked about work, about plans for the weekend, about everything and nothing, and I tried to keep up the facade. But it was exhausting, pretending that everything was fine when it felt like my world was falling apart. One evening, as I was clearing the dinner table, Tyler's father turned to me, his expression serious. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He frowned, his eyes searching mine. "You've been distant lately. And Tyler's been acting strange. Did something happen while I was gone?" I felt a lump form in my throat, and for a moment, I considered telling him the truth. But the thought of seeing the hurt and betrayal in his eyes was too much to bear. "No," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's fine." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "If something's wrong, you can tell me," he said quietly. "I'm here for you." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes, but I didn't say anything. How could I? How could I tell him that the person he trusted most had betrayed him in the worst possible way? My name is Anna, and I am well into my 50s. At first glance, I am an ordinary wife and mother, living a typical American life in a small town. My husband, Tom, and I have been together for over 30 years. Life is measured, settled, morning coffee, evening news, talking about everything and nothing. But here, who would have thought that one chance meeting would completely turn my idea of reality upside down? Last week we had a family dinner. I cooked dinner and Tom's son from his first marriage, his name was Jack, stopped by. More accurately, we'd always called him my stepson, but there was always something subtly alien about the term. We rarely saw each other. He'd grown up in another state and was now a grown man, even starting his own family. It seemed like an ordinary dinner with my husband and his son, but when Jack walked into the room, I couldn't believe my eyes for a moment. It was him, the very man I had once known. We'd met by chance many years ago, our paths had crossed, but life had taken its course and we'd had to part ways. I tried to forget, because then everything seemed so fleeting and almost impossible. We lost touch, and then we stopped thinking about each other, or at least that's what I thought. And there he was, in front of me, the same Jack, but now as my husband's son. The whole time at dinner, I tried to act normal, but I was seething inside. I tried not to look at him for too long, pretending he was nothing more than a stepson to me. But the memory swept over me with such force that I could barely focus on the conversation. Tom was saying something, and I was nodding and agreeing, but I wasn't there at all. When dinner was over and Jack left, I felt both relieved and strangely wistful. The evening had reminded me of the past I'd been hiding so carefully. Lying in bed next to my husband, I mentally went back to the moments when our story with Jack was just beginning. It's a funny feeling you're far from young, but your heart still clenches like a young girl's. The next day I went back to my daily routine, but now I couldn't get the thought of meeting him out of my head. A week went by, and I couldn't let go of the thought of Jack. I mean, what was so special about meeting him? I mean, he'd been part of the family for a long time, even if it was a long distance. But something deep inside me was different. I kept thinking back to our last meeting, to those occasional evenings when we'd been walking and talking, as if the whole world belonged to us. It was a strange feeling, the feeling of being with someone who understood me. And now he's here again, so close, and I don't know what to do about it. At some point, I realized I was starting to look for reasons to see him again. Should I take him out to dinner? Or ask him to help with something around the house? I made up all kinds of excuses just to be near him, to see him laugh, to hear his voice. These feelings were so unfamiliar, because in the last few years, Tom and I had become predictable and quiet. I'd even forgotten what it was like to worry about someone. A few days later, it was Tom's birthday, and I decided to have a small dinner for the family. Jack arrived with his wife and kids, and it was another challenge for me. I watched him furtively, trying not to betray my feelings, while trying to convince myself that it was just nostalgia for the past and not something more. Yet her heart told her otherwise. At some point, Jack was alone in the kitchen, helping me set the glasses down. Our hands accidentally touched, and I felt a faint electric shock. He looked at me and smiled softly, as if he understood without words. I averted my eyes, feeling my heart start to race. Something inside broke, and I realized I couldn't just forget about my past. When the guests started to leave, Jack stayed behind, helping to clear the table and put away the dishes. At one point we were alone together in silence, and he said, "You know, I'm glad we met again. I thought for a long time that I'd never see you again." His words left me confused, and I barely found the strength to say anything back. "Me too," I whispered, afraid my voice would give away everything I was feeling. In that moment, I realized that I was falling in love with him again, even though it seemed impossible. After that night, everything changed. Jack and I started texting innocent messages, short phrases, and jokes, but I felt like there was something more behind it. Every time his name appeared on my phone screen, my heart started beating faster. Those messages were like little sparks that grew into a flame with each passing day. One day Jack suggested we meet for a cup of coffee, explaining that he needed to talk. I agreed without hesitation, even though I knew I was taking a risk. We met in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, where I didn't think anyone would recognize us. When I entered, he was already waiting for me at a corner table, and when I saw him, I felt a slight excitement, like when I was young. We talked about life, about the past, about what had once been between us. As if by some unspoken agreement, we avoided mentioning our spouses, trying to create a separate world for ourselves, where it was just us. The conversation became more and more personal, and I felt the memories flooding back over me. At one point, he took my hand and squeezed it lightly, and I couldn't resist. His touch was so familiar and yet so frightening at the same time. "I never forgot you," he said quietly, looking straight into my eyes. Those words cut through the silence and seemed to stop time. I felt all my resolve and common sense fading away. As if under hypnosis, I leaned toward him and our lips met. It was only a brief, silent kiss, but it brought out feelings in me that I didn't even remember. When we pulled away, I realized what I had done. Embarrassment, fear, excitement all mixed up inside me, but I also felt a strange relief. We had crossed the line and there was no turning back. After our kiss with Jack, I found it hard to be myself. Normal days seemed strangely empty and artificial. Every time I met him, I drifted further away from my normal life, and it became harder and harder to hide it. We began to find ways to meet in secret, as if we were playing a dangerous game where the cost of losing could be too high. Our meetings took place in secluded corners where no one could see us, in parks on the outskirts of the city, in quiet cafes where almost no one went, or even in a car parked far away from crowded places. Every moment with him felt forbidden, but that only made it all the more appealing. I felt like I was finally living, even though I realized I was fooling everyone around me. One day, when I got home from my meeting with Jack, Tom noticed that something was wrong with me. He looked at me carefully and asked, "Is everything all right? You look tired." I tried to squeeze out a smile and mumbled something about a busy day. But a sense of unease was growing inside me. I knew I couldn't go on like this for much longer. Every day I was around Tom, I felt like he suspected something. His stares became more intense and his questions more frequent. At times like this, I tried not to give myself away, but the fear of exposure settled in me, making every meeting with Jack seem like the last. In the back of my mind, I knew that sooner or later, someone would figure out what was going on. It was almost impossible to hide the feelings that were growing stronger. On the one hand, I knew I was playing with fire, but on the other hand, I couldn't stop. It all came to a head the day Jack and I made one small but fatal mistake. We met again at the same coffee shop on the edge of town. It was late fall, there was hardly anyone in the coffee shop, and I felt like nothing could go wrong this time. We sat, talking, laughing, and then he touched my hand, and I, losing my caution, allowed myself not to take it away. At that moment, I noticed someone looking at us. It was a neighbor whom Tom and I often ran into at the store and at neighborhood parties. She recognized me instantly. Our gazes met and I felt an icy chill inside. At some point, Jack was alone in the kitchen, helping me set the glasses down. Our hands accidentally touched, and I felt a faint electric shock. He looked at me and smiled softly, as if he understood without words. I averted my eyes, feeling my heart start to race. Something inside broke, and I realized I couldn't just forget about my past. When the guests started to leave, Jack stayed behind, helping to clear the table and put away the dishes. At one point we were alone together in silence, and he said, "You know, I'm glad we met again. I thought for a long time that I'd never see you again." His words left me confused, and I barely found the strength to say anything back. "Me too," I whispered, afraid my voice would give away everything I was feeling. In that moment, I realized that I was falling in love with him again, even though it seemed impossible. After that night, everything changed. Jack and I started texting innocent messages, short phrases, and jokes, but I felt like there was something more behind it. Every time his name appeared on my phone screen, my heart started beating faster. Those messages were like little sparks that grew into a flame with each passing day. One day Jack suggested we meet for a cup of coffee, explaining that he needed to talk. I agreed without hesitation, even though I knew I was taking a risk. We met in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, where I didn't think anyone would recognize us. When I entered, he was already waiting for me at a corner table, and when I saw him, I felt a slight excitement, like when I was young. We talked about life, about the past, about what had once been between us. As if by some unspoken agreement, we avoided mentioning our spouses, trying to create a separate world for ourselves, where it was just us. The conversation became more and more personal, and I felt the memories flooding back over me. At one point, he took my hand and squeezed it lightly, and I couldn't resist. His touch was so familiar and yet so frightening at the same time. "I never forgot you," he said quietly, looking straight into my eyes. Those words cut through the silence and seemed to stop time. I felt all my resolve and common sense fading away. As if under hypnosis, I leaned toward him and our lips met. It was only a brief, silent kiss, but it brought out feelings in me that I didn't even remember. When we pulled away, I realized what I had done. Embarrassment, fear, excitement all mixed up inside me, but I also felt a strange relief. We had crossed the line and there was no turning back. After our kiss with Jack, I found it hard to be myself. Normal days seemed strangely empty and artificial. Every time I met him, I drifted further away from my normal life, and it became harder and harder to hide it. We began to find ways to meet in secret, as if we were playing a dangerous game where the cost of losing could be too high. Our meetings took place in secluded corners where no one could see us, in parks on the outskirts of the city, in quiet cafes where almost no one went, or even in a car parked far away from crowded places. Every moment with him felt forbidden, but that only made it all the more appealing. I felt like I was finally living, even though I realized I was fooling everyone around me. One day, when I got home from my meeting with Jack, Tom noticed that something was wrong with me. He looked at me carefully and asked, "Is everything all right? You look tired." I tried to squeeze out a smile and mumbled something about a busy day. But a sense of unease was growing inside me. I knew I couldn't go on like this for much longer. Every day I was around Tom, I felt like he suspected something. His stares became more intense and his questions more frequent. At times like this, I tried not to give myself away, but the fear of exposure settled in me, making every meeting with Jack seem like the last. In the back of my mind, I knew that sooner or later, someone would figure out what was going on. It was almost impossible to hide the feelings that were growing stronger. On the one hand, I knew I was playing with fire, but on the other hand, I couldn't stop. It all came to a head the day Jack and I made one small but fatal mistake. We met again at the same coffee shop on the edge of town. It was late fall, there was hardly anyone in the coffee shop, and I felt like nothing could go wrong this time. We sat, talking, laughing, and then he touched my hand, and I, losing my caution, allowed myself not to take it away. At that moment, I noticed someone looking at us. It was a neighbor whom Tom and I often ran into at the store and at neighborhood parties. She recognized me instantly. Our gazes met and I felt an icy chill inside. She didn't say anything and just looked away, but it was clear to me that rumors would now spread faster than I could imagine. The next day, Tom came home later than usual. I heard him put his keys on the table and stood in the hallway for a while, silent. He walked to the kitchen and, without looking at me, said, "We have to talk." My breath caught. I knew what he was going to ask, but I tried to convince myself it was just fears. He sat down across from me and calmly asked, "Are you cheating on me?" His voice was impassive, almost lifeless. I tried to say something, to justify myself, but the words stuck in my throat. In that moment, I realized I couldn't lie anymore. I nodded, confessing, and a shadow of pain ran across his face, which was immediately replaced by cold determination. "With who?" he asked, already knowing the answer, but as if testing to see if I could be honest to the end. When I said Jack's name, there was anger, bewilderment, and perhaps even disappointment all at once on Tom's face. He stood up and walked silently out of the house. I was alone in that silence, and the realization came over me that my whole life was now forever changed. After Tom found out the truth, the real storm began. He disappeared for days without answering his phone, leaving me in the dark about what would happen next. A heaviness hung over the house that could not be dispelled by words, thoughts, or tears. I barely slept, replaying in my head everything that had brought me to this moment, to the destruction of what I'd spent years building. Jack was gone, too perhaps afraid to see Tom, or unsure of how to behave, or maybe just trying to hold on to what little he had left of his family. I felt utterly alone, caught between two people I had once loved and who had now turned their backs on me. A few days later, Tom returned. He was calm, but there was an icy determination in that calmness. He offered me a divorce, and I couldn't find the words to stop him. There was no point in begging him to forgive me or trying to explain. I realized that everything I had done had broken his trust and that our relationship would never be the same again. The divorce process was quick and almost painless from a legal standpoint, but every document I signed felt like a verdict. Our shared memories, our friends, our home, all of it had turned into empty memories, leaving behind only bitterness and regret. I never saw Jack again. I heard that he had moved away, too, deciding to start a new life away from both of us. Sometimes I wanted to see him again, to talk to him, to try to figure out if it was a momentary weakness or something more. But in the end, I realized that maybe that's what was meant to happen. Sometimes love can't withstand time and circumstance, and all that's left is the pain of a broken past. Looking at my life now, I realize that it was my choice, my mistake, and my responsibility. The price I paid for this affair was too high. I lost not only my husband, but also the part of myself that believed in stability and fidelity. The morning started as usual. I woke up before anyone else. A habit I'd picked up in the couple years I'd been married to John. He's the kind of man who's always in a hurry, even when there's plenty of time. The house was quiet. Michael, my 17-year-old stepson, was still asleep. I turned on the coffee maker and started making breakfast: scrambled eggs and bacon, toast, and fresh orange juice. John appeared in the kitchen about 15 minutes later, still in his pajama pants, but with his laptop under his arm. "You're my hero," he murmured, sniffing the air and smiling. "It smells amazing." "And you're not dressed yet." I nodded at my watch. "Aren't you going to be late?" He just waved and grabbed a mug of coffee. John was easy. He was my island of stability after a turbulent youth, and frankly, I loved him for it. Michael showed up in the kitchen just as John was about to leave. Sleepy, disheveled, headphones in his ears. He didn't even look at me as he poured himself some cereal and milk, and then he mumbled something to himself and went back to his room. "Do you know what to do with him?" John asked, putting his coat on by the door. "He's a teenager," I shrugged. "Teenagers are like that, aren't they? Just go easy on him. It's not easy for him." John left, leaving me alone with Michael. I put in my headphones, put on a playlist of energetic songs, and started cleaning. Michael rarely spoke to me. From the beginning, he clearly wasn't thrilled that his father had remarried. I tried to stay out of his way, even though it hurt sometimes. It was like he only saw me as an outsider. When I finished cleaning, the house was quiet again. Just me, the kitchen, and the music playing in the background. But this morning only seemed ordinary. I decided to occupy myself with baking. It always calmed me down, even when things were a mess at home. Rummaging through the shelves in the kitchen, I found a recipe for an old apple pie that had always failed in my youth. Why not try it again? I laid out the ingredients: flour, sugar, cinnamon, eggs. Everything was going smoothly until I found the whisk stuck in the drawer under the sink. Crap. I bent over trying to pull it out with one hand, the other holding a cup of sugar for some reason. Naturally, the sugar ended up on the floor and I ended up on all fours. At that moment, I felt someone's presence. I turned around and there was Michael standing right in the doorway. "What are you doing?" His voice was a chuckle and embarrassment at the same time. "I'm playing kitchen acrobat," I replied, standing up and tucking in my robe, which opened when I reached for the whisk. "Sorry about the view." He looked at me like he didn't know how to react. I must have looked weird because I wasn't wearing anything under the robe. "Did you need something?" I asked, trying to pretend that nothing unusual was going on. "I was just thirsty," he mumbled, and went to the refrigerator. Michael poured himself some water and stood there instead of leaving. I felt a little awkward. "Do you like apple pie?" I asked, trying to fill the pause. "Dad said you were a good cook." That was unexpected. I was used to his one-word answers, but this was a whole sentence. Thank you. I smiled. So you'll stay to try it when it's ready? Maybe. He still hadn't left. He stood leaning against the table, watching me knead the dough. I tried to relax, but his eyes were drilling into me. You know, I don't think you're what everyone says you are, he said suddenly. Who says what? That you're trying to be liked? That you're trying to replace Mom? The words caught me off guard. I stopped, clutching the bowl of dough. I'm not trying to be your mom, Michael, I said calmly. I just want you to be comfortable. He didn't say anything back. Just shrugged, left the empty glass on the table, and went off to his room. I exhaled. This short conversation was the most personal thing that had ever happened between us. But something in his tone made me wonder. The pie went into the oven, and I finally sat down with a cup of coffee. The whole scene with Michael hadn't gotten out of my head. His words stuck somewhere between logic and intuition. He's just a teenager, I reminded myself. He's got a bunch of emotions he doesn't know what to do with. I was starting to get distracted when I heard his footsteps again. Michael appeared in the doorway, pulling the hoodie over his head. He didn't look annoyed this time, but rather puzzled. Smells good, he said, nodding at the oven. Uh-huh, we'll be able to try it in half an hour. He sat down slowly at the table, as if watching me. He usually ate on the run or sat in his room. I could tell he wanted to say something important, but he hesitated. Was something wrong? I asked, trying not to startle him. Why did you agree to marry my father in the first place? He suddenly asked, looking straight at me. That question threw me off a little. Because he's a good man, caring, kind, and also, he loves me. Do you love him? I almost laughed at that direct question. Of course, Michael. I wouldn't have married him for nothing. Sometimes it just seems like you're here because you're comfortable. I froze. His gaze was too serious for a 17-year-old. That's not true, I said softly. It's hard for me too, especially with you. With me? He snorted, but there was more sadness in his voice than sarcasm. Yeah, I'm not always like that, am I? No, it's not that. It's just, you're distant, and I'm having a hard time figuring out how to approach you. Michael was silent for a long time, staring at his desk. I don't know what to do with you, he said quietly. I put my hand on the table, a little closer to him, but not touching. Well, you give it a try. We can just start with normal conversations. He nodded, but immediately added, You know, you're beautiful. The second of pause turned into an eternity. Thank you, I replied, trying not to let my voice waver. But let's save the compliments for girls your age. Michael lowered his eyes, blushing. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. It's okay. We were both embarrassed, and tension hung in the air. I decided to change the subject and got up to check on the pie. 10 more minutes, I said, trying to look casual. Michael mumbled something like, okay, and walked out. When he was gone, I finally exhaled. This conversation had been a revelation to me. He may have been looking for support, but his manner of speaking sometimes veered into strange territory. I realized I'd have to be even more careful from here on out. It started as usual. I was back in the kitchen, cleaning up another mess in the drawer under the sink. Spoons, jar lids, and the little things I never threw away always fell there. This time I dropped a tablespoon, and it rolled far behind the pipe. Sighing, I knelt down and bent down to retrieve it. I held the cupboard door with one hand and fumbled in the depths with the other. And just then, Michael walked into the kitchen. Oh, he unbuttoned his pants. I felt hot inside me, and I turned around, almost banging my head on the sink. Michael, can you give me a warning when you come in? I blurted out, trying to stay calm, though I felt hot for what he was doing. It was unexpected of him, but it felt good. Can you not get stuck under the sink? He replied with a weird chuckle. Okay, I'm out of here, he said, turning around and pulling on his pants. When he walked out, I breathed a sigh of relief. But standing in the middle of the kitchen, I realized that I was starting to lose control of the situation. Michael was clearly trying to communicate more, but sometimes his behavior was too ambiguous. Something about him was changing, and I didn't know how to react to it. And this time I decided that I wasn't going to ignore what was happening anymore. I had to figure out where the desire to help ended, and where the fine line between stepmother and a teenager who was clearly confused about his feelings began. The next morning began with a slight uneasiness. Michael behaved as usual. He locked himself in his room and hardly showed his face. But there was an empty plate in the kitchen. He must have eaten a piece of last night's pie while I slept. I tried to imagine how to develop our relationship further. After all, I'm not only his father's wife, but I'm also somehow someone who should be a support to him. Toward lunchtime, Michael came downstairs. He looked more chipper than usual and didn't even escape my gaze. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, to lighten the atmosphere. "I could," he answered briefly and sat down at the table. I poured him a cup and put it in front of him, and sat down across from him. "I was thinking maybe you should try talking to your father more." "Why?" "Because you're so angry with him. It's obvious without even saying it." Michael looked up. There was a flicker of surprise in them, but he quickly hid it behind his usual indifference. "He thinks he knows what's best for me," he said. "But he never asks me what I want." "Then tell him. Talk to him." He snorted. "That's easy to say. You can see he's always busy." I sighed. "You wouldn't believe it, but he does care about you. He's just not very good at it." Michael hesitated, swirling his mug. "Do you feel sorry for me too?" "No," I said firmly. "I respect you, and I want you to know that I care." He was silent, and we both sat in that strange but almost cozy silence. At one point, he suddenly said, "You're strange. You're not like the others. Is that a bad thing?" I smiled, trying to hide the awkwardness. "I don't know." He stood up. "Just, thanks for the tea." I followed his gaze as he walked away. That brief dialogue made me think. Michael was clearly reaching out to me, and yet his words often went beyond what I expected. He was looking for a connection, but perhaps he himself didn't know what kind. The next day, I suggested that John talk to Michael. He agreed, but it was obvious he was uncomfortable. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked. "Absolutely. You need to find common ground." I knew Michael needed to have this conversation, but I was realizing more and more each day that I needed to set clear boundaries too. Something in our interaction was starting to get out of whack. John came home from work late, as usual, but when he saw me in the kitchen, he stopped. He looked tired, but he noticed my serious expression. "Is something wrong?" he asked, undressing and hanging up his coat. "We need to talk." I set a cup of coffee in front of him and gestured for him to sit down. John sighed and sat down, looking at me with slight concern. "It's about Michael." "What is it again? Did he do something wrong?" "No, it's nothing like that. I just feel like he's getting more and more distant." John frowned. "He's a teenager. That's normal." "Yeah, but I think he needs more attention. He feels like you barely talk to him." "I am talking." "John, you're talking the way bosses talk to their employees. You're giving him instructions. That's not communication." He sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. "Okay, what are you suggesting?" "Just talk to him. Ask him how he's doing, what's going on at school, what he's worried about." John didn't say anything. He looked lost, and I felt a little sorry for him. "Do you think he hates me?" he asked quietly. "No," I answered, putting my hand on his shoulder. "He just needs to realize that you're listening to him." John nodded, but I could tell by the look on his face that he was doubting whether he was going to make it. "You're good at this, you know," he said suddenly, looking at me. "With what?" "With Michael. With our family. It's hard for me to imagine what it's like for you." I smiled, but my insides clenched. John had no idea how his son made me feel sometimes. "Thank you. But you have to try harder too." He nodded, and we decided that he and Michael would spend the weekend together. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how confused I was. I couldn't ignore how out of balance I was sometimes by talking to Michael. His words, his looks, they seemed to want to say more than I could afford to hear. I rolled onto my side, watching John sleep next to me. He trusted me, and I couldn't let that trust crumble. But thoughts of Michael still kept me awake. In the morning, I woke up before everyone else, as I always did. The sunlight was streaming through the kitchen curtains, making the house cozy and somehow especially peaceful. Michael came into the kitchen first again, but this time he looked relaxed. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Uh-huh," he mumbled, opening the refrigerator. I noticed that he'd brought a plate from his room, a rare gesture for him. Michael didn't say a word, but the way he carefully placed the plate in the sink felt like the beginning of something new. "Dad, had you decided what you were going to do with your father this weekend?" I asked to keep the conversation going. "He wants to go fishing," Michael snorted. "Why would I want to go fishing?" "It's an opportunity to spend time with him." I tried to keep my voice calm. Michael looked at me, as if trying to see how serious I was being. "He thinks fishing will solve everything? And you don't think it's worth a try?" He stopped talking, and I realized he was thinking. "Okay," he finally said. "I'll give it a try." I smiled, satisfied that the conversation hadn't turned into an argument. We both started breakfast, but the atmosphere was strangely casual. For a moment, I felt like there was some sort of truce between us. "The pie was delicious last night," Michael said suddenly. "Thank you." He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he added, "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be." I laughed. "Well, thank you, Michael. Is that a compliment?" "I guess so," he said. And for the first time in a long time I saw a slight smile on his face. That moment reminded me that despite all the difficulties, we had a chance to be a family, even if it wasn't perfect. The day passed quietly. John got home from work early and even tried to talk to Michael. They argued a bit about fishing, but eventually Michael agreed. That evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, Michael came in again. "Hey," he said, feignedly nonchalant. "Hey, do you need something?" He hesitated, then asked, "Do you really want me to patch things up with him?" "Yes, it's important for both of you." "And for you?" I looked at him, trying to figure out what he meant. "It's important to me that you're happy, Michael." He held his gaze on me again, and I felt the air in the room grow thick. "Okay," he said quietly, and then he turned and walked out. That was the end of it. No more strange conversations, no more hidden undertones. The next day, Michael and John went fishing, and I stayed home, savoring the rare moment of silence. But in the back of my mind I knew it was still early days. Michael and I had found common ground, but it made our relationship even more complicated. I now realized that sometimes there was a fine line between intimacy and boundary. That night began like any other, and I had no inkling that my life was about to take an unexpected and wild turn. My stepson, Daniel, had always been a bit reserved. In his early 20s, he was brimming with energy, confidence, and that carefree spirit that often accompanies youth. He had a close-knit group of friends who frequently visited, and they would spend hours playing video games, jamming to music, or discussing topics I found hard to relate to. On that particular evening, Daniel returned home with his friend Jake. I'd seen Jake around a few times, but had never really interacted with him. He was tall and had striking features that always caught my attention. There was something about him I couldn't quite identify, but I noticed how he carried himself, especially the way his gaze lingered on me a bit too long, igniting feelings in me that I hadn't experienced in years, a thrill, a tension that was both unsettling and exciting. As the night wore on, Daniel and Jake slipped into their usual routine in the living room, their laughter and chatter filling the house. I assumed it would be another quiet night and headed to bed early, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Around midnight, a soft knock echoed from my bedroom door. Half asleep, I initially dismissed it, but the door creaked open, revealing Jake standing there alone, his eyes sparkling with a mix of confidence and curiosity. "Hey, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of something beyond just casual conversation. I blinked, trying to comprehend why he was there. "Jake, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be with Daniel?" He smiled slowly, a gesture that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't sleep, and I thought maybe you couldn't either. His words hung heavily in the air, and my heart raced as I became acutely aware of the tension between us. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. That night began like any other, and I had no inkling that my life was about to take an unexpected and wild turn. My stepson, Daniel, had always been a bit reserved. In his early 20s, he was brimming with energy, confidence, and that carefree spirit that often accompanies youth. He had a close-knit group of friends who frequently visited, and they would spend hours playing video games, jamming to music, or discussing topics I found hard to relate to. On that particular evening, Daniel returned home with his friend Jake. I'd seen Jake around a few times, but had never really interacted with him. He was tall and had striking features that always caught my attention. There was something about him I couldn't quite identify, but I noticed how he carried himself, especially the way his gaze lingered on me a bit too long, igniting feelings in me that I hadn't experienced in years. A thrill. A tension that was both unsettling and exciting. As the night wore on, Daniel and Jake slipped into their usual routine in the living room, their laughter and chatter filling the house. I assumed it would be another quiet night and headed to bed early, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Around midnight, a soft knock echoed from my bedroom door. Half asleep, I initially dismissed it, but the door creaked open, revealing Jake standing there alone, his eyes sparkling with a mix of confidence and curiosity. "Hey, I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of something beyond just casual conversation. I blinked, trying to comprehend why he was there. "Jake, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be with Daniel?" He smiled slowly, a gesture that sent a shiver down my spine. "I couldn't sleep, and I thought maybe you couldn't either." His words hung heavily in the air, and my heart raced as I became acutely aware of the tension between us. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. My throat felt dry as I struggled to find words. Was he really okay with this? Was it a game or a test? Before I could dwell on it, Jake leaned in closer, his hand gliding up my arm, sending another shiver down my spine. I should have stopped him, but I couldn't. My body was responding to a pull I couldn't resist. Daniel watched, his expression unreadable, as Jake's hand teased the limits of how far I was willing to let this go. To my shock, Daniel didn't intervene, he merely observed, as if waiting to see how far I would let it progress. The night blurred into a whirlwind of emotions, desire, guilt, excitement, fear, all merging into a confusing haze. Jake and Daniel were relentless, their attention overwhelming, and I found myself surrendering to the sheer thrill of it. They didn't let me sleep that night, not even for a moment. Just as I thought I might find a chance to rest, one of them would stir things up again. I was exhausted, yet strangely unwilling for it to stop. By the time dawn began to creep through the curtains, I lay there utterly drained, my mind racing with everything that had unfolded. Jake was the first to slip out, giving me a lingering glance that sent my heart racing. Daniel lingered a bit longer, his expression inscrutable before he too quietly left. I lay there for what felt like hours, trying to process everything. What had I just done? What did it mean for my relationship with Daniel and Jake? Guilt crept in, mingling with the lingering thrill of the night before. As the day wore on, however, I realized something else. This was a secret, our secret. No one else had to know, and I was certain Daniel and Jake wouldn't say a word. It was a moment that had transpired in the heat of passion, something I couldn't take back but didn't have to let define me. Still, an unsettling feeling lingered, whispering that this wasn't over. The way Jake had looked at me before leaving, the way Daniel had stayed just a bit longer, it was as if they both understood that this was merely the beginning. Strangely, I found myself looking forward to what might come next. As the day unfolded, I was left with memories of that night, the way they had both made me feel, the excitement of something forbidden that I never expected. But as the weight of my actions settled in, I couldn't shake the thrill that accompanied the guilt. I replayed every moment in my mind, questioning what it all meant. Each time I recalled Jake's hands on me or Daniel's quiet presence beside me, a mix of emotions surged within me: guilt, desire, confusion, and above all, anticipation. A part of me didn't want it to end there. I continued my day as usual, attempting to maintain my routine, but my mind was elsewhere. When I saw Daniel later that afternoon, he barely spoke to me, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a vivid dream. Jake hadn't returned, but I felt certain I would see him soon. That night, I lay in bed again, but sleep evaded me, every creak in the house making me jump as I anticipated one of them, either Daniel or Jake, walking through the door at any moment. Before long, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart raced as the door creaked open, and in stepped Jake, his expression calm and confident. He crossed the room and sat at the edge of my bed, just like the night before. This time, there was no pretense, no casual conversation. He knew why he was there, and so did I. My breath caught as he leaned in close, brushing my arm in that same electrifying way. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the intensity of his gaze pulling me in like a moth to a flame. Just as things began to heat up again, the door opened for a second time, and my heart skipped a beat as Daniel stepped inside. His face remained unreadable as he quietly closed the door behind him, just as before, locking it with a soft click. I felt a swirl of emotions, anticipation, fear, and an electrifying thrill at the same time. Would he stop us this time? But like the night before, Daniel simply took his place on the other side of the bed, watching and waiting. The tension in the room was palpable, nearly unbearable. I couldn't fathom how we had reached this point, how they had come to share this secret with me. There was something intoxicating about the danger of it all, the forbidden nature of our actions, the unspoken understanding that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. Yet here we were, doing it anyway. Jake leaned in closer, his lips hovering just a breath away from mine, and I succumbed to temptation once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I was acutely aware of what was happening, fully conscious of the consequences, yet I couldn't stop myself. The thrill of it, the excitement, the sheer audacity of our actions, it consumed me entirely. Daniel watched, his gaze fixed on us as Jake kissed me softly at first, then with increasing urgency. My mind spun as my body responded uncontrollably. I knew it was wrong, but the intensity of the moment overwhelmed any sense of morality I had left. Before I knew it, the night blurred into yet another whirlwind of passion and secrecy. Jake and Daniel took turns pushing me to my limits, testing how far I was willing to go, and I found myself unable to resist the allure of something so dangerous, so thrilling. I never imagined myself as a stepmother. Life with Jason in the suburbs had a predictable rhythm, quiet evenings, yard work on weekends, and the occasional visit from his 18-year-old son, Zach. Zach had always been polite, even a little reserved around me. His visits were brief, just weekends or holidays. But this summer was different. He was moving in for a few months, before starting college. Jason thought it would help them reconnect. I didn't mind, Zach was easygoing, and I figured we'd adjust. That night, Jason was working late, and I had the house to myself. It was one of those stifling summer evenings, where even the AC struggled to keep up. After dinner, I decided to shower and change into something comfortable, a simple gray bra and matching boy shorts. It wasn't meant to be anything suggestive, just my go-to for hot, sticky nights like this. I grabbed a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, scrolling on my phone. The house was silent except for the low hum of the AC. I wasn't expecting anyone home for hours. But then the front door unlocked, and my stomach dropped. Zach walked in, backpack slung over one shoulder, his face still slightly damp with sweat. He must have been out with friends. Our eyes met, and his froze on me. "Oh, sorry," he stammered, immediately turning his back to me. I was equally mortified. "Zach, you're home early." I blurted out, grabbing the throw blanket beside me and pulling it over myself. "Yeah, the guys canceled plans," he said, not turning around. I didn't mean to, interrupt. "It's fine. I didn't think anyone would be back this soon," I said quickly, trying to sound calm. My face felt like it was on fire. He mumbled something and bolted upstairs. The sound of his door closing echoed through the house, leaving me alone again, but far from relaxed. The next morning, I woke up determined to act like nothing had happened. Zach came downstairs for breakfast, his movements a little awkward. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Morning, he muttered, avoiding my eyes. I decided to address it head-on. About last night. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. He froze for a second, then shrugged. It's fine. I shouldn't have barged in like that. No, really. It's your house too, I said, trying to sound lighthearted. I should have been more careful. He nodded, but the way his gaze flicked to me and quickly away didn't escape my notice. There was something unspoken in the air. For the rest of the day, he kept his distance, but I caught him glancing at me a couple of times. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me feel uneasy. Over the next few days, Zach's behavior shifted. He became quieter, retreating to his room more often. When we did interact, he seemed distracted, avoiding direct eye contact. At first, I brushed it off. He's 18, I told myself. Teenagers are weird. But then Jason mentioned it. Zach's been acting kind of off, he said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. Off how? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. I don't know. Quiet. Withdrawn. Maybe he's just nervous about college, Jason said with a shrug. You're good at talking to him. Maybe check in? I nodded, though my stomach turned slightly. I had a feeling I knew what was on Zach's mind. A few days later, Jason was out running errands, leaving Zach and me alone in the house. He was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling on his phone. I decided it was time to talk. Hey, I said, sitting down across from him. Can we talk for a second? He glanced up, wary. Sure. I just wanted to check in. You seemed kind of quiet lately, I said carefully. Zach hesitated, his shoulders tensing. I don't know. I guess I feel out of place here sometimes. I frowned. Why would you feel that way? This is your home too. He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the table. It's just different. And, about the other night? I felt my chest tighten. Zach, I'm really sorry about that. It wasn't my intention to make you uncomfortable. He finally looked up, his face red. It's not your fault. I didn't know what to do. It was awkward. Yeah, I get that, I said softly. But let's just put it behind us, okay? No need to make it a bigger deal than it is. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After that conversation, things slowly returned to normal. Zach seemed more relaxed, and our interactions felt natural again. Still, the experience stayed with me. I realized how easily small, innocent moments could snowball into misunderstandings. For Zach, it was probably just an embarrassing blip in a summer full of changes. For me, it was a lesson in how careful I needed to be in my role as a stepmother. Jason never suspected anything was amiss, and I was grateful for that. Some things are better left unsaid. Life went on, and by the time Zach left for college, the house felt a little quieter, a little emptier. I hoped he'd look back on this summer with good memories, despite the awkward moment we shared. In the end, it was just one of those things, no harm done, and no lasting consequences. Life moved forward, as it always does.